Thank you for coming. This is Asian Cultural Evolution Seminar, and today we have Ritwika, VPS. She's an affiliate researcher with Professor Anne Wolamont in the Department of Communication, UCLA, following a postdoctoral appointment in the same laboratory. And prior to that, she received her PhD in physics from University of California, Merced. Her research program develops integrated computational and theoretical frameworks to study how social interactions operate under constraints and shape collective outcomes in complex adaptive systems, spanning cognitive science, social science, and ecology. So, yeah, please start your talk.
Thank you, Kenji, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me here. I'm really, really excited. I would like to hold off on answering any of the more involved questions till the end of the talk. But if anybody has questions about some aspect of the talk itself that isn't super clear, definitely feel free to interrupt at any time. So Kenji sort of summarized the context of my work, and what I want to add to that is that my work is very interdisciplinary and broadly complex systems oriented. And within that context, the research I'm going to talk about today brings together elements from statistical physics, ecology, data science, and a lot of the really rich literature in the domain that studies how infant and caregiver vocal interactions shape infant vocal development. Oh, also, am I audible? Okay, thank you. Um, so there are two prongs to the story that I want to talk about here. What we do here is we present a framework that posits that infant caregiver vocal interactions can be understood as a foraging process or a search process. And in doing so, I also present a starting point to navigating the inherent burstiness or temporal clustering that is seen in vocalization time series across multiple timescales over the course of a day. And I make the case for controlling for this kind of inherent temporal structure broadly in excuse me, in behavioral time series when attempting to assess or study interactive effects. Um, this is really sort of a little bit of an on the nose slide, but I do think this whole setup I have outlined here sort of naturally gives rise to this question of, so how is this relevant to cultural evolution? And I want to try and walk you through how I think of this. The immediately obvious thing is, I think, how language and culture are interlinked, because language is a really important carrier of culture, with linguistic features encoding extant social norms, values, and broadly culture. And in doing so, language enables cultural transmission while also being a culturally transmitted system that cultural evolution acts on. I really like this paper here by Professor Kenny Smith that outlines this and links this conceptual paradigm of cultural evolution and language as a cultural system to language learning itself by highlighting how this language learning process is indeed an intergenerational cultural transmission process. And thematically related is how the process of how languages evolve over time is shaped by and in turn shapes the cognitive capacities that underpin language learning. So, for instance, Professor Morten Christensen has argued how universal cognitive constraints that are imposed by the human brain have resulted in universal tendencies in how languages are structured and used, and even in characteristic patterns observed in vocal exchanges in early childhood. So, for instance, and I'm going to get to the details of what I mean by burstiness in a bit, but essentially, this burstiness of vocalization time series that is quite central to this talk has been theorized to be one such pattern, which is selected for to engage with domain general attentional and memory processes that support learning. And finally, I think I would be remiss to not mention this paper in elaborating on the theme of cultural evolution and language. So this paper, I think it's TICS, Topics in Cognitive Science. It proposes how studying infant vocal development can be used as a framework to model the evolution of language itself by taking into account both intra and intergenerational selection. And I think extending this framework to cross-cultural contexts can provide an even richer framework that allows for the modeling of how different cultural contexts can further shape how language evolves. So put together, what we have is this picture of language as a complex, adaptive cultural system across multiple temporal scales and cultural contexts. And the study of infant vocal development and language learning as something that can inform our understanding of how language evolves, and simultaneously is also the study of an important cultural transmission process. So to really get into that, infant vocal development, infant vocal behavior thing, I want to try and set the stage a little bit. Babies undergo really dramatic changes in their vocal repertoire in the first year of life. So the first clip I'm going to play here is from a newborn baby. And the second clip is from an 8-month-old baby. So I hope that was audible. And you can immediately see that these two clips are really very different. So the first sound that you heard from the newborn baby is very much dominated by a cry. And the second one sounds much closer to language, relatively speaking. So these kind of sounds, which have a characteristic vowel, consonant, repeat, are important precursors to actually being able to speak. And broadly, while these speech precursor sounds dominate infant vocalizations at all ages, there is also evidence that the proportion of non-speech related sounds, like these cries, as you heard in that first clip, and also laughs, decrease with age. These changes are in part due to anatomical changes and neuromaturation, but also to a great extent due to learning that is facilitated by social interaction. So there is really a big social learning aspect here as well. Overall, the way I like to describe this is infant vocal development is a complex adaptive process where a continuous sequence of increasingly structured vocal behaviors unfold over time. And this is supported by a combination of self-directed vocal exploration and external social cues like parents or caregivers' vocal input. So there's that aspect of exploration versus exploitation here in baby's vocal practice. So for instance, these speech precursor sounds can be directed or undirected. And while these sounds occur frequently in social context that is directed to somebody else, they are more frequently undirected and happen as the baby is sort of, just exploring vocally by itself. So this can be thought of as some sort of internally motivated vocal exploration. And the social aspect of the production of speech precursor sounds is often characterized by this back and forth vocal interactions between infants and their adult caregivers. But what is not entirely clear is how these social vocal interactions between infants and parents or adult caregivers shape infant vocal development. And one hypothesis in this context is a social feedback loop between infant caregiver vocal interactions and the infant's evolving speech. Essentially, it is hypothesized that adult vocalizations serve as rewards that guide infants' exploratory vocal practice, and that some infant sounds are more appealing to adults. And this leads to cycles of back and forth vocalization patterns that guide infant and adult vocal behavior and reinforce both overall infant vocalization and specific infant vocalization types. So what we get here is a picture of active vocal exploration by infants that is motivated by both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. And this is what I mean by the exploration versus exploitation paradigm, where in addition to self-guided vocal exploration, adult vocal interactions also serve as external motivators that guide infants' vocal exploration in more structured ways. So this combination of exploration and exploitation is something that is also observed in adaptive foraging processes, and it is one of the key aspects that motivates the foraging perspective I present here. So foraging is defined as the collection of processes that organisms engage in to obtain resources that are necessary for survival and reproduction. And some examples of foraging processes are shown on the left here. So just collection of images. So you can see a bear foraging for mushrooms, you can see birds searching for food, and you can see a deer grazing. So historically, foraging has been a predominantly ecological field of study, but in its most bare bones form, foraging is simply a search process by one or multiple agents in a landscape that's characterized by a resource distribution. And one way to describe a foraging process to demonstrate this search on a landscape aspect is to sequentially map out the movement of the organism or the agent doing the foraging. So we're just mapping out a trajectory here. An example is shown here depicting foraging patterns in spider monkeys. You'll have noticed that foraging processes also evolve in time because the foraging agent is moving around as time passes. So there are two basic descriptive axes to foraging processes, time and space. What I show here is a very cartoonicized depiction of a foraging process. We have a foraging agent, which is the bunny here, and it's searching for rewards, which is carrots, in a two-dimensional space. And that is, two-dimensional space is usually what a lot of biological foraging processes happen in. A priori, this bunny does not know where the carrots are. It just knows that carrots are food and that acquiring food is good. So it hops around, as you see here. And you can see how that process unfolds in space as a foraging trajectory here on the left and how it evolves in time on the right. The foraging trajectory shown here on the left is just a sequential collection of these step sizes A, B, B, C, C, D, etc. And these step sizes are just the distances between subsequent foraging stops or foraging events. And what you see on the right here is the corresponding event time series, where each foraging event is marked by a green line at the time that foraging event happens. The inter-event intervals, or IEIs, which are the times between subsequent foraging events, essentially. These are the temporal mirror of the step sizes on the left, and these inter-event intervals are also indicated here. In a lot of, especially the earlier foraging literature, these inter-event intervals are also called flight times because some of the really influential foraging work was carried out in albatrosses. There are two things that you can immediately see here. The first is that longer step sizes in the foraging space are roughly associated with longer inter-event intervals, or IEIs, between those events. And the second point is what makes the depicted foraging process adaptive. So keep in mind that this is not a common feature of all foraging processes. So you can see that initially, the bunny is exploring with relatively longer steps in a more global search, and this is also reflected in the IEIs in the event time series. Finding a reward at point C, and this is indicated in both the spatial trajectory here and the event time series, results in the bunny switching to relatively shorter steps and correspondingly shorter inter-event intervals in a more sort of exploitative local search, which then diffuses into longer steps after not encountering another reward for a bit, and in an adaptive switch to, once again, what is an exploratory search. So it is this adoption of exploratory versus exploitative search strategies in response to resource encounter that makes this an adaptive foraging process, and that the foraging agent is adapting to the resource environment. One of the really cool things about this combination of short and long foraging steps is that a lot of foraging processes have a fractality to them. So essentially, the complexity of foraging trajectories shows similar patterns across scales. This is often called a scale-free pattern, and an example is shown here showing albatross foraging trajectories. And you can see that as you zoom in, which is indicated by the red square, trajectories show similarities in the pattern of short steps interspersed with less frequent long steps. So this is, a zoomed out trajectory, and we zoom into this red square here. And then we further zoom into this red square here, and you can see that throughout these zooming in processes, there continues to be short steps interspersed with longer steps. So that's what I mean by, this fractality or the self-similarity. Simply put, there is a hierarchy of clustering here. And because the spatial structure of foraging trajectories are followed by the temporal structure, this kind of hierarchical clustering is also evident in the event time series. And that really nicely brings us to this next piece of the puzzle, which is that infant vocalization time series are inherently bursty. What I mean by that is that infant vocalizations tend to occur in these clusters of, vocalizations that are really close together in time. And specifically, infant vocalizations tend to occur in nested or hierarchical clusters over the course of a day, as seen here. The circles here in the top panel show vocalization onsets for a 9-month-old infant over the course of the day, and this horizontal axis represents time. And zooming into 1 hour in this period, which is indicated by this gray rectangle, we still see vocalization clusters as we saw in the day-long panel. So that's this 1 hour here. And then zooming into a 5-minute time scale shows that clusters appear even at this scale. So there is an observation here of fractal-like or scale-free patterns in the temporal structure of infant vocalizations across multiple timescales. In addition, while not shown here, the collection of adult vocalizations forming the infant's adult vocal environment also occurs in clusters that are temporally coordinated with the infant's own vocalization clusters. So put together, these observations point to two commonalities that we see between adaptive foraging processes and infant-caregiver vocal interactions: the exploration-exploitation paradigm and the observation of hierarchical clustering in the temporal structure. And grounded in these observations, I propose an interpersonal foraging framework to study infant-caregiver vocal interactions, where infants and their adult caregivers act as interacting foraging agents who modify each other's vocal behavior through vocal engagement. Within this framework, these social vocal responses from each other serve as foraged for rewards or the resources for infants and adult caregivers. And very much like the adaptive foraging processes from earlier, resource acquisition, so that would be the receipt of a social vocal interaction in this context, and that modifies infant and caregiver vocalization behavior. The interpersonal framing here in particular speaks to the fact that these rewards being foraged for are time dependent and are generated by the agent's own foraging behaviors. A concrete hypothesis I put forth within this interpersonal foraging framework is that given the time series of infant and adult vocalizations as shown here, we expect shorter inter-event intervals or IAIs following social engagement for both infants and caregivers, reflecting more intense exploitative surge after receiving a reward. In this time series depiction, infant vocalizations are in blue, as you can see here, and adult vocalizations are in black, and the inter-event intervals are calculated between consecutive vocalizations of the same category. So infant to infant inter-event intervals or adult to adult inter-event intervals as the time from the offset or the end of the first vocalization in the sequence to the onset or the start of the second vocalization in the same category sequence. However, the burstiness of infant vocal behavior and to a lesser extent also of adult vocal behavior is a challenge here, because without controlling for this burstiness, it's really impossible to determine whether either agent is modifying vocal behavior in response to the other. So for instance, consider this 5-minute window with infant vocalization onsets shown as a time series. There are some bursty vocalization clusters here, as you can see, where the infant is vocalizing with onsets very close to each other. And suppose there is an adult vocalization onset here, indicated by this red arrow. Without first controlling for the clustering in time of infant vocalizations, it cannot really be reliably determined whether infant intervocalization intervals within this burst decreased or became shorter following the adult vocal response, or whether the adult is just happened to vocalize during an ongoing infant burst. So the hypothesis, therefore, becomes this. We expect shorter inter-event intervals, or IEIs, following social vocal engagement after controlling for that inherent burstiness in infant and adult vocal behavior. To test this, we use day-long naturalistic infant-centered recordings that are recorded on a typical day in the home environment. So these capture infant vocalizations and their acoustic environment, which includes vocalizations by their adult caregivers. The day-long naturalistic context is important here because it really helps us capture these ecologically valid contexts that are extended over the course of the day that the infant is likely to experience on the day-to-day, and therefore are more salient to the cumulative language learning process. The data used in the study comes from 54 infants at ages 3, 6, 9, and 18 months, and the longitudinal data collection over the course of multiple infant age time points allows us to look for relevant developmental trends, if any. Put together, this dataset consists of a total of 200 day-long recordings and over 2,400 hours of audio that is recorded and automatically processed by the Lena Pro system, which consists of a small audio recorder that is placed in the chest pocket of this cloth vest that a baby can wear, as you see here. And the associated software automatically segments each audio recording into sound segments and labels it as shown under the speaker column here. And in addition to these speaker labels, the data for the study also includes the start and end times of each of these vocalizations, and therefore the duration of each vocalization. For this study, we focus on two specific sound types. The first is these child speech-related sounds, such as the speech precursor sound we listened to earlier. And we shorthand this as this is CHSP, and adult vocalizations, which we shorthand as AD. The AD or adult category really collectively makes up the set of all adult vocalizations that form part of the infant's vocal environment. And going forward, I'm just going to refer to the child speech-related category as broadly infant vocalizations. So once we have this data, we can make a time series. We can construct a time series of infant and adult vocalizations as shown here. And this time series is what all analyses and results presented going forward focus on. To test, now the central question is to test the effective social responses, right? And to do this, what we want to do is we want to operationalize what it means to receive a response. So basically, we want to test the effective social responses on the length of infant and adult vocalization intervals. And for that, we first need to figure out what it means to receive a response. We start with the infant and adult vocalization time series as shown here, and we have the onsets and offsets of both. The infant vocalizations are in blue, and the adult vocalization is in black. We then define a response window parameter, which we shorthand as TRESP. And how this TRESP parameter and the response estimation works can get a little confusing, so I'm happy to go over it again in questions or answer clarifying questions here. Using the infant as the focal vocalizing agent and the adult as the responder, so that means that adult vocalizations serve as rewards for the infant. This is an example of the infant receiving a vocalization. So how this works is from the offset or the end of an infant vocalization, if there is an adult vocalization start within that TRESP window as shown here, without an intervening infant vocalization, then we consider that first infant vocalization in the sequence to have received an adult response. And the associated infant inter-event interval is considered to be a with response infant inter-event interval. And we shorthand that as a RESP-IAI. For the opposite case, where an infant vocalization does not receive an adult response, let's look at this first infant vocalization in the series. And I have not shown the response window time period here to reduce a bit of visual clutter, but you can see that there is no adult vocalization within that response window time period of the starting from the end of this infant vocalization. So we say that this vocalization has not received a response, and the associated inter-event interval, which is this time period, is called an IAI without a response, and we shorthand that as a no RESP IAI. At this point, as it stands, a response can occur at any point within that response window, within that TRESP window, and the associated IAI would be a response IAI. But the thing is, to determine that a response has not occurred, we need to wait that full TRESP window, which means that a no response IAI will always be at least as long as that response window, that TRESP window. So automatically, there is a bias for response IAIs to be shorter because of how we formalize this response computation. So to control for this, we discard all inter-event intervals that are less than that T-response window when doing response analyses. So as an example, let's look at this inter-event interval that is indicated here by these dashed gray lines. This IAI is obviously, it's clearly shorter than that response window, and we don't include this in our analyses testing for the effect of response receipt on vocal behavior. Here is another example of this control, the last inter-event interval here. Without this control of discarding inter-event intervals that are shorter than that T-response window, this would be counted as an IAI that is associated with a response. But because it is shorter than the response window, it is excluded from all response analyses. We use a range of 0.5 to 10 seconds with the 1 to 10 second range in 1 second increments to perform a sweep for the response window parameter. So this includes timescales that are relevant to really immediate back and forth vocal turn taking by infants and adults, but it also allows us to test for more general effects of vocal stimulation through social input using these longer T-response values. So in summary, what the response window parameter does is it sets the time scale of interaction. More precisely, it sets the upper limit for a response to occur, and it also provided, given this control of discarding inter-event intervals that are shorter than the response window, sets the lower limit for intervocalization intervals to be admitted for our analyses. So for example, let's look at this T-response window of 5 seconds to determine response receipt and to test the effect of adult responses on infant vocalizations. All adult responses with a start, with an onset within that 5-second response window, is going to contribute to what counts as a social vocal interaction. And infant inter-event intervals, or IAIs, are only admitted into response analyses if they're at least as long as this response window of 5 seconds. Once we do this for the entire data, we get a collection of intervocalization intervals. So what we have is the set of infant and adult IAIs for the vocalization time series on the top, shown here at the bottom. IAIs associated with a response are shown in green, so these. IAIs not associated with a response are shown in red, and IAIs excluded from response analyses because they are shorter than the response window are shown in these gray diagonal hatches. This collection of IAIs is the data we analyze, and we do this by first implementing a control for burstiness, that inherent temporal structure and vocalization time series, and we follow this up by our response analyses. And finally, we separate inter-event intervals into age blocks for this two-step analyses pipeline. So we do these analyses separately for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 18 months. To implement the burstiness control, we first note that within a vocalization burst, as shown here, so below here, vocalizations follow each other closely with short inter-event intervals between subsequent vocalizations. That is to say, short IAIs are chained together in a burst. So we look at how the current inter-event interval is predicted by the immediately preceding IAI. I want to show what that looks like, but before that, we appropriately transform the variables, both for visualization and for analyses, by taking the log and then z-scoring both the set of current IAIs, which is on the y-axis, and the set of previous IAIs, which is on the x-axis. So shown here is the graph of current inter-event intervals versus previous inter-event intervals for the 18-month age block, subsampled for visualization. An important thing to note here is that all inter-event intervals, all infant inter-event intervals at 18 months go into this burstiness control step. We then estimate the correlation between current and previous inter-event intervals using a linear mixed effects model to predict the association between current and previous IAIs with infant ID as a random effect. This little hat here in the regression expression indicates that the variables have already been transformed as shown. The regression line here is shown as this dark red dashed line, and the slope of the line indicates the correlation between current and previous IAIs for this set of inter-event intervals, which in this case is the collection of infant IAIs at 18 months. A positive slope, as is the case here, points towards temporal clustering, and I'm going to expand this a bit more when I talk about our results. This previous IEI effect, which is, as I mentioned, the slope of the regression line in the previous slide, is essentially the strength of the association between the previous and current inter-event interval. And that is shown here for the 18-month infant IEI data as the blue circle, and the error bar indicates 99.9% confidence intervals. And as you can see, we see a positive correlation as expected from that positive slope of the regression line. This correlation is significant at the p less than 0.001 level, and all results I present are at the same significant level. The corresponding adult IEI correlation is shown in black here, and that is also positive, indicating temporal clustering in the adult vocalization time series as well. And zooming out and looking at how these estimated correlations manifest for the entire dataset at different infant ages, we see that there are robust positive correlations between successive inter-event intervals for both infants, shown in blue here, and for adults, shown in black, at all infant ages. These shaded portions represent the 99.9% confidence intervals. And without going into too much detail, these robust positive correlations are reflected in our validation dataset as well, which is quite a bit smaller compared to the automatically labeled DLong dataset. I haven't really talked about the validation data due to time constraints, but based on results from the validation dataset, these positive correlations are not artifacts of the automatic labeling, and they're very robust to the labeling method. On the other hand, though, the differences in the strength of correlations in between successive IEIs for infant versus adult vocalization. So these seeming differences are not validated, and neither are these age trends that seem to be here. Based on these validation data results, we suspect that the differences between adult and infant correlations, as seen here, are likely to be a mislabeling artifact of the automatic labeling process. And as for the age trends, we suspect it is the case that our validation dataset does not have sufficient statistical power to resolve those trends. Now we have a robust measure of the temporal clustering and vocalization time series, expressed as correlations between successive inter-event intervals for both infants and adults. And this forms the crux of implementing the burstiness control, because we can expect these correlations between successive IEIs to confound measures of how social responses affect subsequent inter-event intervals. And to control for this inherent temporal structure, we estimate the residuals after predicting the effect of the previous inter-event interval on the current inter-event interval, which is simply the residuals of this regression line here. So now we can run response analyses on these residual inter-event intervals instead of the inter-event intervals themselves. And in doing so, we are able to control for this correlation between current and previous IEIs. And this is the data we do the response analyses on. We test these residuals of inter-event intervals associated with a response, and we test whether these response residuals are systematically shorter than IEI residuals without a response. We use a linear model for these response analyses with residual IEIs as the dependent variable and a binary response variable as the explanatory variable. Here, the normalized in this figure, the normalized frequency distribution of residual IEIs with response are shown in green here, and the distribution of residual IEIs without a response are shown in red. And this is for the same 18-month infant inter-event interval data shown previously, and we use a response window value of 5 seconds for response assessment here. These residuals have been z-scored after discarding the residuals of inter-event intervals that are less than the response window. So visually, you can see that the residual distribution without a response has a longer tail, indicating the presence of longer residuals, and also that the residual distribution with response is slightly more shifted towards shorter residuals. What we do with a linear regression is we test whether there is a systematic, statistically significant trend that reflects this. And as it turns out, the difference in the distributions of the residual inter-event interval distributions with and without adult responses at a response window of 5 seconds for that 18-month infant IEI residual set is statistically significant, as shown by the orange circle here. Once again, 99.9% CI's confidence intervals are indicated by the error bar. What I show here is the beta values from the linear regression testing the effect of adult response received on infant inter-event intervals after controlling for the burstiness of infant vocalization events. A negative beta value, as you see here, indicates that receiving an adult response is followed by shorter inter-event intervals than expected after we control for that burstiness. And the farther down a beta value is from the 0 value, which is indicated by this dashed horizontal line, the stronger this effect is. With the 5-second response window, with the response window on the x-axis, this negative beta value indicates that for all infant inter-event intervals longer than the 5-second response window, inter-event intervals following an adult response within that response window are systematically and significantly shorter than inter-event intervals without an adult response after controlling for burstiness. The IEI shortening effect after receiving an adult response is consistent across all 4 ages, 3, 6, 9, and 18 months, as shown here. And zooming out even more, you can see that this trend holds for all ages and all response windows greater than or equal to 2 seconds, except for infant IEIs at 6 months for a response window of 2 seconds. So by and large, for long enough response windows, we see a robust and consistent effect of receiving an adult response on infant vocalization patterns, with infants vocalizing sooner than expected upon receipt of a social vocal interaction from a parent or a caregiver. And while there appears to be the opposite effect, that inter-event intervals seem to increase following a response for very short response window values here, we think it is due to the tendency of speakers to not overlap and because vocalizations have minimum durations within the automatic labeling scheme. So this response window approach might not be the best approach to look at the effects of social interaction at very short temporal thresholds. And without going into too much detail, results from our validation data in the same trend in the same direction as the response effects shown here, although most results for the validation data did not reach statistical significance at p less than 0.001, which we think is likely due to the small sample size. And finally, as you can see from these overlapping confidence intervals, these response effects are not significantly different as a function of infant age. Looking at the adult vocalizer perspective, we see similar effects for how receiving an infant vocal response modifies adult vocalization patterns. Simply put, for all response windows greater than or equal to 2 seconds, receiving an infant response results in adults vocalizing sooner than expected, once again after controlling for that burstiness. Results from the validation data similarly trend in the similar direction as shown here, which is a nice sanity check. And for very short response windows, as you can see here, we see somewhat different patterns than we did for, how adult responses affected infant vocalization patterns. But ultimately, we think this also comes down to similar reasons, that speakers have a tendency to not overlap and that vocalizations have minimum durations. Specifically, the automatic labeling scheme imposes a shorter minimum duration for infant vocalizations than adult vocalizations. And we think this contributes to this pattern seen here for response windows of 0.5 seconds and 1 second. So putting it all together, these results validate the interpersonal foraging framework we propose. So we see that infant and adult inter-event intervals are shorter for following a social response. And this is consistent with viewing infant and adult caregivers as interacting foraging agents, with some of the rewards being foraged for being social vocal responses or social vocal interaction from each other. The central theme of this work was really to test whether receiving a social vocal response increased the likelihood of subsequent infant and adult vocalizations in line with that foraging framework, where we view infant caregiver vocalization behaviors as this interactive interpersonal foraging process where infants and adult caregivers act as interacting foraging agents who modify each other's vocal behavior. The inherent burstiness of vocalization events, and particularly so in the case of infant vocalizations, has consistently proved to be a challenge for this kind of determination. So here we analyzed inter-event interval time series, and that was inspired by similar analyses in the foraging literature, to first implement a control for the inherent burstiness and vocalization time series, and to test for the effect of social responses and vocalization behavior following this control. And more broadly, we also demonstrate the need to control for base rates in studying behavioral signals and propose a methodological framework to implement such a control. These results really show robust positive correlations between consecutive inter-event intervals for both infant and adult caregiver vocalizations, and these effects are robust across investigated infant ages and labeling methods. And this reflects the temporal structure of vocalization behavior and complements other measures of event clustering in vocal and other behavioral domains. In particular, this correlation metric is analogous to the memory measure outlined in this 2008 paper on burstiness in memory in complex systems, which we were not actually aware of when we came up with this control. But crucially, our method generalizes this measure to a corpus level measure for large behavioral data sets, and it is amenable for use in contexts where there are multiple observations from the same set of individuals. So this correlation measure has really broad potential utility as a measure of event level clustering to assess temporal structure, and can be particularly advantageous to study interactive behaviors, since it can be used to control for clustering when investigating the immediate effects of social interactions, as we have shown here. And I think this can be especially methodologically relevant to studying cultural evolutionary processes, both the importance of controlling for inherent temporal structure and the use of this generalizable correlation measure to achieve this control. Once we implement this control for burstiness, we demonstrate that social engagement does indeed result in infants and adults vocalizing sooner than they would otherwise. These effects are present for shorter timescales where back and forth turn taking is relevant, and also for longer timescales, demonstrating the effect of more general social interaction at longer timescales. And put together, our results provide robust support for these, for the facilitatory effects of social engagement on both infant and adult vocalizations in these naturalistic, ecologically relevant contexts after controlling for the inherent burstiness of vocal behavior. And crucially, this is the first analytical effort of its kind, to the best of our knowledge, that demonstrates that social responses indeed do have a stimulating effect on both infant and adult vocalizers after implementing such a necessary control. And finally, these results also provide support for the interpersonal foraging framework, which allows for the use of the really rich foraging literature and perspectives to study how humans learn language and develop communicative frameworks. The burstiness control and the interpersonal foraging framework presented here can be used together or independently to study vocalization behaviors in other species and also sociocultural contexts, other communication modalities, or broadly even other behavioral time series. So for instance, many animal communication systems share the burstiness of communicative signals and the importance of social vocal engagement and vocal development. And I think it would be particularly interesting to investigate the extent of burstiness and vocalization time series cross-culturally and how that shapes patterns of social vocal interactions. And zooming out even more, and I think especially relevant to a more explicitly cultural evolutionary perspective, it would also be interesting to look at these trends longitudinally to see how over the last decade these patterns might have changed as the relevant sociocultural and technical landscapes have evolved. There are, a number of considerations that can add further richness to this approach. So for instance, this control using, correlations between subsequent inter-event intervals does not necessarily capture the complete correlation structure of these behaviors, and incorporating more vocalization history has the potential to refine these results. For what it's worth, we did do supplementary analyses incorporating the effect of the previous 2 IEIs into our analysis pipeline, and these results have remained robust. But the thing is, these vocalization time series have really rich temporal structure, and it would be really interesting to see how long range these correlations really are, even if they're weak, and how that might affect and shape vocal interactions. And also, unlike the observation of spatial exploration versus exploitation in foraging processes that typically tend to be anchored to a physical space, such as when a deer forages for resources, there isn't really a ready equivalent in this context, a ready spatial equivalent, that is. I have some previous work looking at an acoustic space representation within this framework, which you can find in this earlier paper here. But this lacks the burstiness control that we have implemented here. I'm working on a more robust approach to this, and there's a pre-registration we have out now But beyond that, something that has come up in research discussions is that even as we're developing that spatial representation or perspective, it might also be possible to think of this exploration versus exploitation in terms of the immediate social context. So it might be that the infant or the adult is exploiting the immediate social context of having received social engagement, which is reflected in the shorter inter-event intervals. And even without that spatial context, there's a sense of the exploration versus exploitation and that foraging lens being realized in the social context perspective. We have a preprint out for this work, and it's under revision at ProcB, so we'll be updating this preprint very soon. And the raw audio data and Lena labels and the automatic labels for participants who gave permission for us to share their data with other researchers are available within the San Joaquin Valley corpus and home bank, and de-identified pre-processed data used in the present paper, as well as all relevant results, are available on OSF, and all code used, both archived and DOI'd and otherwise, are available on GitHub and Zenodo. So yeah, that is that. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. These days, I just want to say that I think this still forms a big chunk of my research, but these days I also think a lot about how evolving technological and information landscapes may be rapidly reshaping language learning, at least to an extent, how languages themselves evolve and spread, and how all of this shapes how we engage with cultural artifacts, and especially textual narratives and other media over time, and even more broadly, how groups collectively solve problems. So I would also be happy to talk about any of that. And I think, as I mentioned to Kenji, I am actively looking for, postdoc or researcher or even faculty positions. So if you know anybody who's hiring, or if you're hiring and you think I might be a good fit, please keep me in mind. And yeah, this work was done at UCLA and to an extent at UC Merced. And we want to thank all the undergraduate RAs who help with data collection and annotation, all the infants and families. These are my co-authors. So yeah, thank you to everybody who supported this work, and thank you to you for being here. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks for your talk. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand or put your name in chat or just unmute yourself. So, but I have some questions
Of course.
about, so I think it's very related to the more thoughts part in the RAS, right? So I'm interested in foraging, perspectives of child vocalization. So in your framework, they are explorative and exploitative vocalization, right? After long IEI and short IEI. So is there any difference in contents, for example, contents or lengths of vocalization between explorative and exploitative ones?
So we haven't looked at that within this control for inherent temporal structure perspective, but in this paper we do look at the quality of vocalizations in a sense, acoustic information, the pitch, and the intensity of vocalization. So what we do is we construct a two-dimensional space and where the axes are normalized pitch and normalized intensity of the vocalizations, and we position these vocal time series as a trajectory in that spatial representation. And we see some, we look at this sort of step size perspective. Oh, do we see shorter step sizes in this acoustic space following a vocal response or not? And we see some evidence for some differences, some shortening, but we did not use this specific approach. We were fitting these step sizes to distributions and looking at distribution parameters, which is a little bit more, obfuscated and less direct than what we're doing here. But ultimately, what seems to be the case is that at least when looking at vocalization intensity and pitch as the primary acoustic dimensions, most of that variation following a response is in the time dimension itself. It seems to be the case that the changes in how receiving a response affects these vocalization behaviors seems to happen in the time dimension itself, with the caveat that everything that I'm talking about was carried out without doing this temporal structure control, and also with the understanding that these vocalizations are really rich acoustically, and there are a lot of other dimensions as well to consider: prosodic dimensions, spectral dimensions, things like that. So in this pre-registration, we're looking at a larger acoustic feature set. So we're looking at the number of syllables, we're looking at not just the mean pitch and the mean intensity, we're also looking at the variation of pitch and intensity over the course of vocalizations. We're looking at the duration of vocalizations, things like that. So we hope to, if nothing else, we hope that this approach is going to provide more information. But my hunch is that there is likely at least a subset of other, dimensions along which the quality of these vocalizations are going to differ as a function of how close they are to vocal interactions. We're still working on that.
So is this kind of like hierarchical clustering structure unique to child vocalization only, or is it common to adults?
It certainly happens in we certainly see that kind of temporarical nested structure in the adult vocalizations that comprise the infant's vocal environment.
Okay.
So it's sort of reciprocal, and very interestingly, the temporal scale, there's a sort of matching between the temporal scale of that clustering between infants and adults. I'm not sure if such clustering occurs in conversations, in adult conversations. It's one of those things I keep meaning to look up and I keep forgetting.
Yeah. I asked you this because like I thought it's easier to measure the quality of the like vocalization or like, analyze content of vocalization for adults because you can use many like statistical approach or like informatics approach. So if you still see the explorative and exploitative dichotomy in adult vocalization, I think isn't it easier to analyze the content difference in vocalization in adults?
What do you mean? Could you elaborate?
Okay,
Do you mean
so
conversations between adults, or conversations or sounds that adults are making to children?
I think either is fine. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
interested in, is there any content differences between explorative and exploitative vocalization
Mm-hmm.
in any context? And if it's difficult to measure the quality of vocalization for children, why
Uh-huh.
don't you study the vocalization of adults
Ah,
to
I see. I
measure
see.
quality?
I think the challenge is that vocal data, like I said, is really, really rich. There are many,
Hmm.
many axes of, along which information is contained. And while I potentially somewhat naively think that I'm obviously, biased towards, I feel like there has to be a difference in quality and content as a function of, whether a response was received or what kind of vocalizations receive a response, that sort of thing. It does become, because the number of features along which this vocalization data exists is so large, it becomes
Hmm.
difficult to identify what would be a salient feature set. Obviously, we can do
Hmm.
dimensionality reduction to identify what are the most salient features, but it's also going to require, I think, a very exhaustive approach. So that is sort of
Yeah.
the challenge here. But again, in this paper, we did look at what vocalizations with what acoustic features are likely to receive responses, and we did see differences in that. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly what the specific features were, but yeah, the vocalizations that received responses had statistically significant differences along the acoustic dimensions we investigated than the vocalizations that did not receive
Mm.
responses.
Thanks. So this is my last question.
Of course.
So in like actual foraging,
Mm-hmm.
the IEI reflects the spatial distances, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what sort of distances are mapped to IEI in vocalization? Because if like so topics are too close, it's naturally requires shorter IEI. But
Mm-hmm.
when you compare the intermediately distant topics and the very distant topics, I don't think the time for you to think about it like how to say like doubles or triples to think
Mm-hmm.
about very distant topics, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so how this foraging perspective applies. So what sort of distances are mapped to time in this
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
framework?
No, I see your point. So, um, interestingly, I want to put forth, you mentioned topics. There is this really interesting paper by, I believe, Thomas Hills, I think, and or Christopher Kello, who is a co-author on this work, that shows that, when people retrieve animal names in a memory game,
Mm,
the semantic distances between different
mm,
clusters of animals are actually correlated to the retrieval time. I think
mm,
it's very, very cool. I think it's a really cool cognitive application of foraging theory.
mhm,
So even as, it might not be, oh, it takes double or triple the time, there seems to be in some cognitive context, a notion of distance even in a semantic space that correlates with the time taken to sort of traverse those clusters, um, which sort of kind of supports my conceptualization of there. I suspect there is some spatial representation
mm,
in which this process unfolds as a foraging process where in this space longer or points that are further apart are going to take longer time to traverse, which is sort of the goal of this pre-registration to test a couple candidate spaces that we think might be salient. Um, well, I had another point that I wanted to make that I completely forgot.
okay, I think it's like partially reasonable, but I so does it explain like very long IEI like about
Oh,
at the time scale of hours or
Oh,
like
oh, no, 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 it
10 minutes or
won't. It
something?
won't, right? Because that's likely, this is also, I think it's not quite accurate to think of this as a one-to-one foraging process. It's sort of
Mm,
like a
mm,
cognitive analogy, but you sort of also have to account for the various behavioral things that are happening, like
mm.
infants sleep during, that
Yeah,
process.
of course.
And also there is effort that goes into producing a sound, and infants can become habituated. Infants can, sort of get bored, and even there's energetic costs to vocalizing, especially as a
Mm,
baby. Some
mm,
sounds are more effortful for a baby to produce. So all of these like various behavioral aspects obviously go into it, but in at least a notion of distance, I think can at least be partially thought of, sounds that are very different from each other take more effort to make for a baby versus an adult. So that could be one way to think of distance. But yes, like
mm,
really, really long IEIs are the result of other, behavioral artifacts over the
mm,
course of what the baby is doing.
mm. Thanks. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Uh, Jin is uh,
Oh,
has
yes.
very long
Yes.
question in the chat, but do you want does
Yeah, let
Jin
me
want me to read it or you wanna unmute
Oh,
yourself and is
I can also read it out if.
okay. Yeah, so please
Okay.
read by yourself.
So, so Jing asks, I'm wondering how conceptual mapping would impact this positive correlation pattern, since children usually start to map concepts systematically around and after 18 months, and that usually impacts how interlocutors interact with the children. Like mapping will change children's exploration, exploitation behavior in the sense that exploration behavior becomes more selective and that they tend to rely more on social information to build accurate mapping. Okay, let me think about this for a second. Jing, could you elaborate on conceptual mapping a little bit? I only have a vague idea of it largely because I tend to study children up to 18 months.
Of course. So basically mapping is somewhere happens. So for example, you see children, they learn the word dog, and they're just gonna call everything dog, right? It's called like overgeneralization because like they learn that like a word, they know that they can map it to like an animal or anything
Mm-hmm,
that is like an agent.
mm-hmm,
But they lack the sense somewhere before 18 months that there's an accurate mapping of that thing. You can only
mm-hmm,
use that concept on certain entity, not everything. So they go through this thing where they try to explore, okay, if I have this concept or I have
mm-hmm,
this word label, how far can I extend this label to this concept? That's called the process of mapping. And
okay.
usually before 18, there, even though there's a language burst, for example, like the babbling at 6 months, it's usually more random. It doesn't really carry this kind of accurate conceptual meaning. So I'm wondering, what would you think this kind of information, because once the mapping happens, it significantly change what the vocal information mean. What are they actually bursting, right? So I'm just
Mm-hmm,
wondering, how do you think this kind of information
mm-hmm,
seeking pattern in both mapping or selectively learning or relying more on social information will change this kind of interaction between the children and the interlocutor? Thank you.
Ah, yes, yes, I see. Thank you. So yes, I do think sort of information perspectives are really useful to think of this process because what is happening is that, babies are going from a high entropy state to a more structured state, right? And my hunch is that we're going to see um, an overall sort of contraction of trajectories that babies go on, and that's likely going to also be reflected in how adults interact with them as babies become older, just because, the entropy, the uncertainty of the entire process sort of collapses as babies acquire more information, more certainty in their language production. Um, I do think because, and this is me sort of guessing a little bit because I haven't systematically thought of this so much. I do think there are going to be somewhat different paradigms as conceptual mapping becomes more salient to babies' linguistic language experience because it is an emerging paradigm that does not exist prior to a certain age threshold. But yes, I absolutely think that the exploration itself is, to sort of hand wavily say, exploration itself is going to potentially collapse a bit um, yeah, the as the baby's age, and I think the transitions between that exploration and exploitation is also going to be less sharp and more diffuse as babies acquire language and develop linguistic and communicative skills. Does that make sense? And I
Yeah,
think
that
uh,
makes sense.
and
Mhm.
I think I really like Kimbrough Aller's work on functional flexibility of vocalizations that sort of is related to these concepts. I think it's a PNAS paper from probably 2000s or 2010s.
Mhm.
But basically that babies like the flexibility, the functional flexibility of different vocalization types is very important in vocal learning, and being able to flexibly use the same kind of vocalization in different contexts is part of that sort of exploratory process.
Yep, thank you. That makes sense.
Thank you.
And yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating to see the same pattern between foraging and language processing. And my question is, I'm wondering whether the reason why we can use this analogy is because the interaction between a baby and the caregiver is somehow like foraging. Like whenever the baby makes the sound, it's like they are wanting something from the adult. But I think this is also somehow related to one of Kenji's previous question about adults' language. So I feel that as an adult or like later, like when the child grows up, sometimes we use language not only as a tool of like foraging or getting something from the caregiver. We also use the language try to express ourselves, or sometimes we would use the language, we would serve as a caregiver. Like actually the language is not asking for something from the environment, but we are providing something. And I'm wondering, like, if we use language for a different purpose, can we still use does the pattern still follow the foraging pattern, or like it changed to something else?
Okay. So something and tell me if this is not at all related to your question. Something that I've thought about, that the way I tend to think about this is, like caregivers to babies is a really asymmetric conversational learning context, right? Like babies have practically no information. They're acquiring this whole system, and adults are providing all of the sort of informational cues, right? And then as babies get older, they have the asymmetry of that learning context is going to decrease, right? And as a sort of it starts to approach a more peer-to-peer learning context in some ways as babies get older. I do think the strength of that foraging paradigm might sort of decrease, which is again related to both what Jingyu asked and I answered. So I think it would be really interesting to compare these results to, both like older children and parents, or even like older child interactions, and even adult interactions. And I think as long as there is a degree of asymmetry in the learning context, I think it is possible that there can be some kind of foraging process unfolding in sort of trying to find common ground, that sort of thing. Again, I'm sort of guessing based on, things that I've thought about, but something that could be related and relevant is Rick Dale and Zachary, I forget his last name, at UCLA have a paper on how in conversations, I think on Reddit, when in dyadic conversations, when people converge on a topic, when people find common ground, the entropy of the conversation collapses, right? I think it's a really, really cool result. And I think that can be viewed potentially through, this sort of foraging lens, where people are searching for common ground. And once that common ground is found, there is a sort of convergence into like really potentially exploitative behavior. But I think what could make it different for, adults or interlocutors that have less asymmetry in their learning context, or even more agency and control over their own vocalization behaviors, is that potentially once that exploration is successful, the exploitation phase is something sort of, like that you can think of as an energetic ground state because the interlocutors can stay there because they have more agency and control and there's less asymmetry in their context. Does that make sense?
Yes, this is very helpful. And I also have another question. So, to what extent do you think this thing is specific to language, or this can be used to explain any interaction that is asymmetric and also, yeah, any interaction that you would want something or want response from the other, like calling your boyfriend, would that, yeah, also somehow match this pattern? Yeah.
I am super biased, right? Because my dissertation, my PhD dissertation was looking at foraging processes in like different contexts and things like that. And I think a lot of behavior can be thought of as a search process in some context, right? Like, I think if I remember correctly, software development has been modeled as a foraging process. A lot of like there's cognitive processes that have been modeled or investigated through a foraging perspective. There's this PNAS paper that I really like that show how babies movements can be thought of as a foraging process. Just like there are a lot of behavioral phenomena that benefit from a foraging perspective. So I think with the right framing, I think it is possible to think of a lot of behaviors as foraging, because what ultimately foraging does, it is trying to optimize the search for an objective. So I think it's possible to do that with the right context or framing. Having said that, I will admit that, I come from a perspective where I use a lot of foraging ideas. Like I've been thinking about how scientific exploration and research can be thought of as a foraging process. There's actually, I forget. There's a Nature Human Behavior or a Nature Com paper. I forget the author's name. They're Josh and Wong at Northwestern. They show that in a lot of artists, really productive scientists all have, these exploration and exploitation transitions that characterize their productivity. There is a paper by Dan Larimer or maybe Aaron Closet that shows scientific productivity as a random walk, which again, a random walk, like a foraging process is a random walk. So like, I think it's really possible in a lot of contexts.
Thank you. I like the idea.
Me too.
So, is there any more question from the audience? Okay, so yeah, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you so much. This was really fun, and thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I stop recording now.